Step into the squared circle, where the bell echoes through decades, where main events become legends and tag teams tore the house down. From the undercard to the top of the card, this is Portland Wrestling at its finest. One ring, one city, 1,000 stories. This is Ringside in Rose City. And here's your hosts, Frank Culbertson and Mike Rogers.
Hey, thanks, Lisa. Another great intro job. I'm Frank Culbertson, alongside the man who knows more about Portland wrestling than anyone,
Mike Rogers.
And this is Ringside in Rose City. One ring, one city, and 1,000 stories. If you're here for Portland wrestling history, the characters who owned the ring, the crowds that brought the noise, the fights that got out of control, the nights that actually defined Portland wrestling, if that's what you're here for, you're exactly where you belong. You're sitting ringside, front row, with Mike Rogers, where he always sat. Now, we're going to be honest for a second. If you think Mike and I show up here with a well-thought-out plan, then you have way more confidence in us than you should. There is no script. There's not even a backup plan. Just a wheel with 10 envelopes on it. And this thing could go off the rails at any moment, and usually does. But we're not in charge here, not even a little. Lisa is, and she's got that ringside wheel with the envelopes just waiting to send us somewhere we weren't expecting. And once it starts spinning, that's it. Mike and I are just passengers on this ride. And if you know Lisa like I do, you know this ride is, as Mike Rogers always says, all gas and no brakes. Mike and I, we are just trying to stay upright till the final bell. So Lisa, if you would, give that ringside wheel a spin. All right, let's see where the wheel is taking us tonight. Lisa, the envelope, please.
Here you go.
Thank you. Mike, the envelope says, they worked here? This envelope has quite a list that you and I put together way back when we were doing Katie Bar the Door, the history of Portland wrestling. Hey, that's available on Amazon. And as our friends John McAdam and Steve Gennarelli at the great Stick to Wrestling podcast have said, Katie Bar the Door is a must for anyone wanting to know about the history of Portland wrestling. And if those two say so, you know that means something. So, Mike, let me hand you the envelope, and let's talk about the first name on the list, a former AWA World Champion. Let's talk about the former Mr. Muscles of Michigan, Dick Garza.
Yeah, Dick Garza, if you were to ask, did the mighty Igor wrestle in the Northwest? I probably would have said no, and I think most people would have said no. But the answer is actually yes. He wrestled here in 1962. He debuted in February and stayed till the middle of June. He started getting a big push initially with wins over guys like Billy White Wolf and Fritz von Goring, Haru Suzuki, Bill Savage, Dean Higuchi. But then in March, he started losing nearly to every one of those wrestlers that he had beaten. We know the mighty Igor in the 70s relied on his gimmick, and he was not a good worker. When he left Portland, he went to Los Angeles, and he would win the tag titles there with Eric Froelich. Eric Rommel.
No, that has got to be a misprint on the internet.
No, that is absolutely the truth. And you know Eric Froelich was the workhorse of that team.
Yeah.
So Mighty Igor Dick Garza would return to the Northwest in late 1963. He'd work at the Vancouver territory. And he started with wins over Jack Pesic and Louis Mayo, the Viking. And then once again, the losses started coming to guys like Gene Kaninsky, Dan Miller, Kinjai Shibuya, Waldo Von Erich, Tex McKenzie. This is the interesting thing that I didn't realize or I had forgotten. Just 3 years later, Dick Garza, the mighty Igor, would be AWA champion for 1 week, but still, and it seems like either Donovan dropped the ball, not promoting him the way that he should be, and or the AWA elevated him to the most highest upper echelon.
You know, there's several things here. The crazy thing about Garza is that he was a phenomenal bodybuilder when he first started, winning, as I said, the Mr. Muscles of Michigan. And when he switched to the mighty Igor, he was still strong, but he had moved more into that big shoulder, big chest type wrestler. And for me, he was just really a goofy gimmick. But Mike, let's look at the AWA Championship match that was taking place Saturday, May 15th, 1965 in Omaha, Nebraska, in what was billed as the last indoor card of the season. Seems that the week before the championship, Mad Dog Vachon, who was the champion, had shredded Igor Vodkis, as he was known, his beloved sheepskin coat to ribbons. That's dastardly. So they come up with a no time limit, no DQ 2 out of 3 falls match. And because neither Vodkit or Mad Dog could agree on a referee, the commission appointed rugged Ernie Dusek to come in and referee the match. The rest of the card was solid. Pampero Firpo, the wild bull of the Papos, taking on the Jewish youngster from New York, Sid Freeman. The hated Japanese meanie Haru Sasaki battled handsome George Drake, and Kalmilikov took on Tiger Joe Tommaso. Now, surprisingly, Mad Dog took the opening fall in the AWA World Championship match in 30 seconds. Igor evened it at 2:15 and took the third fall in 7:30. Fans stormed the ring and Igor kissed as many as he could. The attendance, 5,201. Now, here's the really interesting part. In the same paper, on the very same page, a couple inches above the results of that card for Tuesday, 10 days away, Mad Dog Vachon was listed as defending the world championship against Sid Freeman. So they gave the results of the card 10 days away on the same page. Now, Igor did defend the title on Tuesday the 18th against the evil Haru Sasaki by DQ, when Haru was DQ'd in the third fall for rubbing salt into the wound on Igor's head that he had received when he fell from the ring. Igor did lose the title back to Vachon, as the paper said, when, after winning the first fall, he was kicked in the groin by Vachon and could not continue, and the title was back to Vachon. Now, I mentioned it was supposed to be the last indoor show, but the paper stated that because the last two shows drew a total of $14,000 box office, the promoters decided, hey, we need to run one more. That's about $145,000 in today's money. Not a bad draw in Nebraska, not a bad payday for Dick Garza. Mike, let's look at another great wrestler, Joe Scarpa or Chief Jay Strongbow.
Yeah, again, he's not associated with the Northwest at all. And so, again, a surprise. He debuted in the Northwest in September of 1959. He gets wins over George Drake, George Coleman, Bill Savage, Bill Wright, Kurt von Poppenheim, Tony Bourne. His run lasted until January of 1960, and he'd only been in wrestling 3 years at that point. And of course, we know Jay Strongbow had a long, long career, and he became the mainstay in the WWF starting in about 1970. And he would continue wrestling there until about 1987. And then he became an agent. And we have a really interesting story featuring Jay Strongbow in one of the interviews in Excitement in the Air, Volume 2 with Lanny Poffo.
Oh, just a minute there. Excitement in the Air, Volume 2. That's that interview book, the second one. Mike, where can our listeners purchase that book?
You can get that at Amazon.
Oh, my gosh. There you have it on Amazon. Besides Katie Bar the Door, Excitement in the Air, Volumes 1, 2, and 3. So, Mike, go ahead with that interview with Lanny.
So here is the question. You can tell the story where you were in Boston and you were just about to get released and you told the office that you would like to go heel. And so this is Lanny Poffo talking. They had too many baby faces and not enough heels. I said, why don't you make me a heel? Chief Strongbow said, you can't be a heel. You're too good looking. I said, you were a baby face and you're the ugliest man I've ever seen. Everybody laughed. That made me laugh too. And what he was saying with is honestly true. Jay Strongbow was not a pretty man.
And you mentioned Lanny Poffo there. We don't cover him on this list, but Lanny Poffo, a lot of fans would not understand that he actually wrestled in Portland as well, didn't he?
Exactly, yes. And one more note on Chief Jay Strongbow. Strongbow's son, Mark Young, came to the Northwest and had a short little stint here. Pat Brady tells the rib that they played when Mark Young was probably driving an old van that Chief Jay Strongbow's, and Pat Brady put the sign up, $500 or best offer, and it was supposedly a very, very nice van.
Oh, that's great. And you said Joe Scarpa, but he's not just Joe Scarpa, because he was identified here as Flying Joe Scarpa from New Orleans. And the same with Dick Garza, Mighty Igor that we just talked about. Scarpa had a very athletic body and was in great shape when he first started here in Portland, a far cry from the Jay Strongbow that would show up years later in the WWF. And unlike Jules Strongbow, Jay Scarpa was a true Native American, whereas Jules Strongbow was Italian American. Now, Mike, let's move on to one of those guys that is so famous, yet is just a blip in Portland, and that's Carlos Belafonte.
Carlos Belafonte, or better known as Carlos Colon, worked here in 1970 and 1971. And when you think about the wrestlers who have been through here, who have drawn the most money, which is the ultimate goal in wrestling, how much money you can draw, Carlos Colon is going to be right at the very, very top of that list. You know, the ones that come to mind are Gorgeous George, Roddy Piper, Sergeant Slaughter, but Colon is right on that list and maybe on top of the list as well. So he debuts here in October of 1970. His results were interesting. He was up and down the card. He had wins over the Claw and Mr. Fuji, and that should have propelled him right into the main events. He teamed with Beauregard and Tony Bourne to get tag team wins over Mr. Fuji and Haru Suzuki, who were tag team champions off and on during that time period. And then he was finally moved up the ladder due to a lack of babyface main events. And then in March, he heads back up to Calgary, where he had come from. And it's probably where he met Abdul the Butcher, and they began their feud that ended up lasting for decades.
And now you always hear about bookers putting themselves on top, and he was booking, but that wasn't the case with Colon. Yeah, he formed and booked WWC, but he only won the world title 26 times. So it's not like he was pushing himself.
Well, he did have to lose it then 25 or 26 times as well.
Absolutely. And you mentioned his legendary feud with Abdul the Butcher. They wrestled over 100 times in matches, maybe not so much as wrestling as practicing bloodletting in the ring. But he was actually one of the biggest names in wrestling history, as you mentioned, and he was right here in Portland. And now let's talk about a guy that when it was announced he was coming into Portland, it was pretty exciting. I know we both had seen him featured in Aftermags, which is how we found out about guys outside of Portland back in those days. Let's talk about the Baron.
Baron Cicluna, Baron Michael Cicluna, came to the Northwest in January of 1973. Yes, he was just 6 months removed from WWF Tag Team Champions with King Curtis. So yeah, I was really excited that he was coming to Portland. He was born in 1929, so that meant that he was already 44 years old when he came to Portland. And Don Owens always has said that he likes action wrestlers, so it did perhaps seem like a strange fit. He debuted on January 6, 1973 with a win over Eddie Morrow, and he also picked up wins over Jim Gagne all around the circuit. He started teaming with Bull Ramos in a feud with Dutch Savage and Stephen Little Bear, and then he was also involved with a very quick feud with Dutch Savage. And then, just a little over a month into his run, which is not long, he lost a loser leave town match to Savage. And then 6 days later, he was back on the East Coast wrestling. And a month later, he was in Japan. So I don't know if this was the plan, just a quick month-long tour to freshen up, or if he came here and it just wasn't a good fit and, they booked him out of the territory. I'm not sure. But definitely, his name didn't live up to what he appeared to be in the ring.
And you mentioned that he picked up wins over Jim Gagne. So Jim Gagne, that has to be a relationship to Vern, doesn't it?
No, we know this. It's not.
How do we know this?
They tell us this every week on Portland Wrestling. Frank Bonneman says, and I know that nobody knows in 1973 who Vern Gagne is, but to be clear, Jim Gagne is no relation to Vern Gagne.
Yes, they told us every week on TV. Frank Bonneman, thank you. And also, a fun fact is he loved to drive. And so after his wrestling career, he was a driver for the New York Times, and that netted him a very valuable pension because he didn't have enough money left over from wrestling. But now let's talk about a guy that fit Portland's gimmicks that Don Owen liked, and that's Akbar the Arab.
Akbar the Arab, Skandar Akbar, another wrestler who I feel most people do not realize wrestled here, and he was here in 1972. He came in January of 1972, and he was kind of slotted into the mid-card status. We had Bull Ramos here already, and he was taking up the main events. But Akbar got some initial wins over Tony Bourne, Beauregard, Tito Montez. He went to some draws with Dutch Savage and Beauregard, and he teamed up with Bull Ramos to get a win over Lonnie Main and Frankie Lane. So he's right on the cusp of making it to the main event. Big guy, not tall, but a big, beefy man. You are thinking that he is going to make it into the main events, or there's a good chance. Then from mid-February to June, Akbar moves up to the Vancouver territory and spends a lot of time up there. So he kind of left Portland before his run should have been over, and it just seemed like they moved him up to Vancouver. Of course, we know that Akbar achieves most of his success in Texas and the Mid-South, primarily as a manager. And then Akbar passed away in about 2010.
Yeah, you mentioned his role as a manager. He had some great success as the leader of Devastation Incorporated. What a great name that is. And they had a zillion different members. I don't know why he couldn't keep them, but here's some of them: Abdullah the Butcher, Steve Austin, Cactus Jack, Greg Valentine, the One Man Gang, Ted DiBiase, Al Perez, Dick Murdoch. Let's see, there was Black Bart, Butch Reed, Kamala, King Kong Bundy, Nord the Barbarian, the Missing Link, not the original, but Dewey Robertson. And, well, I have to stop listing them all because we're going to run out of time. He had a lot of great stables down there. And it's funny to me that he never made it to the WWF, who loved wrestlers with gimmicks and used managers a lot, but he just never got that opportunity for whatever reason. Okay, so now let's move on to a wrestler who worked as a Native American, but it wasn't a gimmick, and that's Bill Wright, Billy Red Cloud.
He started his career in 1952. He came to the Northwest in 1958. He started in the Seattle territory. And back in that time, Portland and Seattle, depending on exactly what time, but they were different territories. And at this time, Seattle was a different territory. But he came down to Portland for 2 matches. He came to Portland in October of 59. And then that's when he had a full run in the Portland territory. And he faced all the top wrestlers, including Eric Peterson, Kurt Von Poppenheim, Tony Bourne, Joe Scarpa, who we just mentioned, Herb Freeman, Doug Donovan, Jerry Kozak. He would head to Hawaii and win the Hawaiian tag titles with the Utica Panther.
Oh, whoa, whoa, whoa. He would head to Hawaii?
Yes.
Oh, man. I wish I knew where I could find out that information. Mike, I hate to interrupt you here, but where can fans find out about what was happening and why he was in Hawaii to win the tag titles?
Well, there is a book. There's a book called Oh Yeah, The History of Hawaiian Wrestling.
And where can our listeners find that book?
You could find that on Amazon.
Okay, very good. See, we are never shy about giving a little advertisement. So go right ahead.
The first instance of Bill Wright transitioning to Billy Red Cloud was 1901 in Ottawa. And he would gain most of his success in the Indianapolis area for the WWA. He would win the world title over Baron von Raschke in 1972. And he would also get wins over Bobby Heenan, Bill Miller, and Blackjack Lanza. So with those wins, they have pushed him to the very top of the card. And at times they would bill him as the world's most popular wrestler. And it's very interesting because at the same time, he had a very sinister and menacing look. He had a bald head, and before that was really, really ordinary. And so his look was very, very striking. In Arizona, he was billed as Killer Kane. That name came from a heel character in the Flash Gordon comic strip. Billy Red Cloud teams with Bobby Bold Eagle in the Indianapolis area, and they make just a great team. And then he passes away in 1981.
Yeah, his legit hometown was White Earth Indian Reservation in Minnesota. And you mentioned that he was called Killer Kane. Killer Kane actually became a face after falling out with former heel partner Chuck Carbo. Yes, crazy Chuck Carbo, one of your favorites, isn't he?
Yes, crazy Chuck Carbo.
Yeah, he's truly an underrated, not just Chuck Carbo, but Killer Kane and Billy Red Cloud. Really, when you look at his matches that he had, he was really underrated, was on top for a long period. So a great wrestler wrestling fans should know about. Now let's move on to a guy who was really likely being groomed for a world title run at some point, and that's Terry Allen, Magnum TA.
Terry Allen comes to the Northwest in kind of a strange way. So the story goes that he was being trained by Buzz Sawyer, and Buzz Sawyer left without finishing his training. And Terry Allen finds out he's in the Portland area, and Terry Allen comes up to try to get his money's worth and have Buzz finish this training. But Terry comes and his training actually gets finished with Sandy Bar. And that seemed to be the best way for him to actually get booked into the Northwest. That did happen. You know, we've talked to Princess Victoria, and they were being trained at about exactly the same time. So Terry Allen debuts against Buzz Sawyer on January 31st, 1981, and he stays until June. And during that time, he had a handful of wins over Tonga John, the Barbarian. We may talk about him in a little bit, and Mike Allen. But this is the best part for Terry Allen. This had to be so rewarding. 4 years later, and we have to really remember, Terry Allen was probably the bottom of the totem pole while he was here. He probably didn't get booked every night. He was kind of one of those fill-in wrestlers. So 4 years later, he returns in 1985 at one of the extravaganza shows, and he goes to a draw with Ric Flair to headline one of the biggest cards ever in Oregon, with attendance of 8,361. So how rewarding is it that he can get booked off and on in the territory as he's starting his career, to come back just 4 years later and to draw over 8,000 people?
And then, of course, in 1986, he would be involved in that auto accident that would end his wrestling career. You mentioned Vicky Otis, Princess Victoria, who was here during the training process and often trained with Terry Allen in the ring. And she talks about that training in Ringside in the Rose City interview that she recently did. It's a great listen if you want to hear some great stories about Portland wrestling, about the Bomber Motel, about the fabulous Moolah, and what Princess Victoria thinks of her, which, well, we'll just leave it at that. So, Mike, listen to this.
Have you heard the strange tales of the Whistler? I'm the Whistler.
Now, that wasn't this guy's theme song, but it should have been. Let's talk Larry Whistler.
Larry Whistler, better known as Larry Zbyszko, came here in 1973, another wrestler who had some very, very early experience in the Northwest. He came to the Vancouver office in May of 73, and he was in preliminaries, and he stayed in Vancouver for about 5 months. He did come down to Portland for a few matches in June and September of 73. He went to a draw with Haru Suzuki, and he had losses to Al Madril and Greg Valentine. And of course, Larry Zbyszko was one of maybe the only protege of Bruno Sammartino, at least publicly. And they eventually had split. They split up, and they took that match to Shea Stadium in New York and drew over 30,000 people. So again, here's somebody who's getting really early work in Portland, and then moving on later in their career and just drawing just an incredible amount of people.
And Larry was a two-time AWA champion as well, adding to the list of AWA champions on this show. And speaking of AWA champions, a third champ is up next. Now, let's not waste time with small talk. Let's do what I do when I go through the drive-thru at McDonald's, and let's go Jumbo.
Jumbo Tsuruta came here for one match in 1974. And he was just in the business for about a year. And Dutch Savage had been on a tour of All Japan, and they had met in Japan in a match earlier in that month that Tsuruta won. And Tsuruta was traveling then around the country, just making very quick stops, stopped in Portland. So Dutch Savage and Jumbo Tsuruta met up in a match for Tsuruta's only Portland appearance, and Savage won. And it's interesting because I can very distinctly remember that match because I was in a different place than ordinary. I wasn't at home. I'm 14 years old, and I'm super excited to watch this match. I had heard of Jumbo Tsuruta already, but I was in a bowling tournament and I was rooming with 3 other rowdy boys, and we were in Salem, Oregon. I made them settle down and watch this particular match. And I remember that Savage won with a roll-up. Now, Tsuruta continues his tour, and he appears in West Texas, Georgia, New York, Florida, Dallas, and St. Louis. And it's interesting because Jumbo Tsuruta's connection to Oregon doesn't end there. He later returns to Portland and he was on staff at the University of Portland doing research in kinesiology. Now, another interesting side note, when this was announced in the Observer, it was listed as Portland University. Now, in Portland, there's a Portland State University and there's a University of Portland, but there is not a Portland University. So Tony Kazina, a wrestler, and I, very much interested in seeing if we could track down Jumbo Tsuruta. We were going to take a morning to travel, but we didn't know which school to go to. And I had spent some time at Portland State, so I searched the staff, and he was not on staff at Portland State. So came to the conclusion that it was University of Portland that he was at, which I found super interesting. He became one of the best wrestlers in Japan's history. He passed away very early at the age of 49 due to a liver transplant surgery complications.
Yeah, if you read the story of that surgery, he basically bled to death during the surgery. It's just an amazing story. But you mentioned his kinesiology. He had a bachelor's degree in political science and he earned a master's degree in coaching in 1997. But okay, the real part of your story is the bowling tournament. At age 14, Mike, tell me, is that where you went and got your Earl Anthony haircut?
Hey, or at least I didn't have the Marshall Holman greasy look.
Oh, those were great bowlers back in the day. You've mentioned Wide World of Sports before, but watching Saturday morning bowling was another fun thing that we used to watch on the 4 channels that we had here in Portland.
On my station, I remember that the bowling would always come on right before Wide World of Sports. And yeah, they had that format where 4th place meets 3rd place, and they'd work the gauntlet down through to the championship round.
Those were great days. Now, one of the very best beginnings of a TV show ever is the very first half hour, the black and white episode of Gunsmoke. John Wayne starts on camera telling people they wanted him to star in the show, but he had movies to do. So he suggested James Arness and told people they would really love him in this role. Now, that is the way to give someone the rub. The Duke puts you over. So speaking of Dukes, let's talk about another Duke.
Duke Kiyomuka wrestled in the Northwest in 1960, came here in March of 1960. He quickly wraps up wins over Jerry Kozak, Larry Lopez, Jack Kaiser, Ed Francis, Luigi Massera, Tony Bourne. After his April 29th match, he went to Texas for 3 months, and then he returns to Portland to work just 1 more month. I had kind of thought originally that his run was through those 7 months, but he went back to Texas for 3 months. So he's only here for 3 months. He captures titles all over the country, including Texas, Florida, Hawaii, where he won the state title in 1948. He was the father of Pat Tanaka, who had wrestled briefly here in the early 1990s. Now, this part surprises me. I don't know why, because when I say that name, I picture him a bigger man, but he was only 5'7" and 180 pounds. From his reputation, you just imagine that he's going to be a little bit bigger. Kiyomuka was living in California when World War II started, so he was interned in a camp called Manzanar. Later on, he buys into the Florida promotion where he owned a percentage of the office from 1985 to 1987. Probably not the best years to own the Florida office, especially in 1987, but he at least made enough in wrestling to buy into the company.
And you mentioned Hawaii, so I got to mention again, oh yeah, the history of Hawaii wrestling available on Amazon, because we cover from the 1930s all the way up to the close of the promotions from Francis and Maivia on. So that's a great book. You should pick it up on Amazon. But Mike, you mentioned Pat Tanaka, and he's rumored to have wrestled in Portland as who?
Matman.
Matman. And where people find that information?
That's in the Encyclopedia of Portland Wrestlers from the House of Action.
What is that book?
It's like a brick doorstop, over 500 pages, but you can find it on Amazon.
And there are a bio of every wrestler who wrestled in Portland wrestling, what we know except 2 that we missed, and results for everybody. But he was rumored to wrestle here as who, and how do we know if it was him or not?
Well, we know the very first Mat Man that appeared was not Pat Tanaka. Moondog Moretti wrestled that individual, and he confirmed it was not Pat Tanaka. We confirmed he was the shits, whoever it was. And then the following week, Pat Tanaka comes in, and I recently saw a picture from WrestleMedia, which is something that a publication that Portland Wrestling would put out, and you can definitely see that there's a picture of Pat Tanaka, and that it was definitely wrestled as Mat Man, at least the second week.
Yeah, great stuff. And so the real Duke John Wayne is the idol to many a Western lover, even those that live in Austin. So let's combine those two facts and let's talk about Austin Idol.
Austin Idol was here for a very quick run in 1978. And when you think about the one that really got away, Austin Idol would be at the top of the list. He comes in June of 78. He got over with huge wins over Dutch Savage, Jerry Oates, Ricky Hunter, Mike George, Johnny Eagles, and he's just set to be involved in a feud with Jimmy Snuka, and he's gone after about a month and a half. Now, I've heard Austin Idol do some podcasts, and he said that he just didn't like Portland, and he's here in the summertime, so the weather is usually great, so the weather wasn't the culprit. Buddy Rose was in the area at the time, and I always think of what a great team Buddy Rose and Austin Idol would have been, and naturally what the feud would have been after they broke up. You're forecasting after that. Roddy Piper was a couple months from debuting, and any interaction between Piper and Austin Idol would have been fantastic. But yeah, you have to wonder if Idol stays, does Piper ever come into the territory? So there's some interesting supposing that goes on there. Idol starts his career as Mike McCord, a big raw-boned wrestler who had a very early run in the WWF. In 1975, he's in the plane crash that kills Bobby Shane. And luckily, Idol only suffers some broken feet and some ribs, and he's out of action a few months. However, when he resurfaces, he has totally changed his body, and now he looks like a bodybuilder rather than that big raw-boned Mike McCord.
Yeah, and he was trained by several people, including Eddie and Mike Graham, and partially trained by Hiro Matsuda. Now, Matsuda didn't break Idol's leg, as he said to have happened in the Hulk Hogan documentary. And did I say documentary or mockumentary? I'm not sure. Anyway, Idol survived the training of Matsuda with no broken bones, but not in the plane crash. Now, let's talk about a man who had a ton of size, was trained by one of the very best ever, yet he didn't win a match in Portland. Tell me about Tonga John.
Tonga John was here in 1981, and Portland always has the reputation for being the place where young talent goes to learn the ropes. But this name never gets mentioned, the Barbarian, and that's because he debuted here under the very obscure name of Tonga John. There's a real interesting story that goes along with this, because I didn't realize Tonga John was the Barbarian. I was sitting with fellow Northwest people, Ken Hamlin and Jim Valley. We're at the 2019 Cauliflower Alley. Haku and Barbarian are sitting at a table close by. And I asked these fellas if they thought Haku had been Tonga John. So we got up our courage to go ask him, Haku, were you Tonga John? And he doesn't say a thing, but he thrusts his thumb towards the Barbarian. Now, I thought it was crazy that, although our guess was wrong, that the Tonga John was actually sitting right next to Haku. Tonga John was trained by Red Bastien. That always seemed to carry a lot of weight with Don Owen. I don't think he won a single match. He faced Buzz Sawyer, Johnny Boyd, Siva Afi, Joe Lightfoot, Magnum TA, and Stan Stasiak. I would like to go back to Buzz Sawyer. Buzz Sawyer in a Tonga John match would have been very, very interesting. I don't know if Buzz Sawyer pulled any shenanigans on Tonga John. Those would be matches to really, really focus and watch. So he spends 3 months in the Northwest from January to April 81. Then he goes 2 years. We don't know where he's at or if he got out of wrestling a little bit. He shows up in West Texas in 1983. And then later, of course, he evolves into be the Barbarian and part of the Powers of Pain tag team.
Okay, now I get that you're sitting next to Ken Hamlin. He, who recently passed away, was a terrific guy, a big supporter of wrestling. But you're sitting next to Jim Valley of the Wrestling Observer. What is wrong with you? You're better than that.
You
We
know,
at Ringside in Rose City love Jim Valley. Shout out to Jim and Wrestling Observer Live Saturdays at 10 p.m. But I got to ask you. So you said you guys went over and asked which one actually spoke the words.
I'm sure it was Jim. I'm positive it was Jim.
I absolutely 100% believe that. Yes, Lisa. Yeah. All right, Mike. You hear that music, and so you know what time it is. It's time for Card Shark. Lisa has the deck in her hands, and she's about to deal out a couple of wrestling cards, different years, different territories, and different moments in wrestling history. Mike, your job is simple. Just listen to the card and tell us what you know about the promotion. You can give us the date, the city or state, and maybe, just maybe, the building. And as you remind me every single day, every single morning by text, every single afternoon, and every evening, you absolutely crushed the first episode of Card Shark.
That's right. I did.
You nailed the 100%, including Boston, which I'm still stunned with. Okay, so Lisa, go ahead and deal the first card.
Here you go.
Okay, Mike, here's the first card. It's Cousin Junior versus the Grappler. It's Jack Victory versus Sweet Brown Sugar. The Rock and Roll RPMs, Mike Davis and Tommy Lane, battle Steve Simpson and Jeff Rates. Flamboyant, Eric Embry versus Steve Dahl. And in the main event, it's six-man tag elimination action. The loser of the fall has to go to the dressing room as Spike Huber, Red River Jack, Kevin Von Erich take on Nord the Barbarian, Eli the Eliminator, and Mr. Jeep Swinson.
All right. So this is interesting because Steve Simpson tells me that it's Texas because I don't think Steve Simpson, besides Portland, ever wrestled anywhere else in the country. There's other names that give me Texas, the Grappler, Kevin Von Erich, Red River Jack. There's also some names that I have forgotten that they ever wrestled in Texas. Spike Huber, Jeep Swenson, Eli the Eliminator, but this is Texas, I'm pretty certain. And with it being this, with only one Von Erich, Kevin Von Erich being on this card, I'm going to say this is late 1986 or early 1987. And early I mean by the first 6 months. Let's go with definitely a Texas town, probably Dallas or Fort Worth, and early 1987.
And what promotion would this be?
World Class, or what came after World Class.
Well, Mike is actually 4 for 4 as he gets World Class Championship Wrestling at the Will Rogers Coliseum, Fort Worth, Texas, April 20th, 1987.
Oh,
Mike.
I'm impressing myself.
This is spectacular. So, well, but now Lisa's got more cards. So, Lisa, go ahead and hand me a second card. Let's see. In the opener, it's Mike Awesome taking on Rockin' Randy. Chris Champion battles Sweet Daddy Falcone. And in a stud stable shootout, it's Robert Fuller taking on Brian Lee. In tag team action, it's the Southern Rockers versus the Dirty White Boys with Ronnie P. Gossett. And in the main event, it's Jeff Jarrett and Bill Dundee locking up with Billy Joe Travis and Terrence, don't call me Terry, Garvin.
All right. Boy, I was going to be stumped after those first three Southern Rockers, dirty white.
You probably thought I was going to say Sweet Daddy Siki, but I fooled you, Sweet Daddy Falcone.
Jeff Jarrett and Bill Dundee. All right. So this is Memphis, Tennessee. Mike Awesome. That's one that's out of place. Everybody else kind of, especially Jeff Jarrett and Bill Dundee, tells me this is Memphis. And I'm looking at the years here. Chris Champion. I'm going to say that this is 1986 Memphis.
Well, you're not going to get credit for this one. It is the USWA, and it's at the Sports Arena Fairgrounds in Nashville, Tennessee. Memphis is very close. Saturday, March 10th, 1990. Ooh. And yes, it is our Southern Rockers.
Ah, interesting, interesting. So I had the territory right, not the town, but I did have the territory right.
You did,
And I was
absolutely.
4 years off.
Put yourself,
All right, all right.
but you're 4 for 5, so you're doing really good. Now, you might have noticed the connection on these cards. There's the grappler, but that is just a coincidence. As Card Shark, this week is being brought to you from the collection of Steve Dahl superfan Jody Day. For those in the Northwest, Jody has an amazing collection of Steve Dahl memorabilia, news clippings, and even a Steve Dahl plushie. She has it all. And if you have ever seen her collection, you know that Steve Dahl is her absolute favorite. So these all come from the collection of Jody Day. And so with that, Lisa, shuffle the deck, cut it a time or two, and let's see if we can come up with something else.
Here you go.
Okay, in the opener, Virgil takes on Bastion Booger. Marty Jannetty battles Crush. Mr. Perfect Kurt Hennig takes on Diesel. And for a championship I won't name, but you will absolutely get right. Razor Ramon, the champion, defends against IRS. In tag team action, Men on a Mission, Mo and Mabel. Boy, did we miss those people. Battle, well done. Oh, wow, how about that? Well done. Timothy Wells and Steve Dunn. And in the main event, Yokozuna steps into the ring against The Undertaker in a casket match. Now, I admit, this is going to be a hard one for you to get the city, the state. You might get the state, but, we had to get Jody Day's Steve Dahl collection completely in here.
Sure, absolutely. All right, this is definitely a WWE card. I'm going to say this is 1993.
Would you like to just guess a state?
Sure.
We won't knock you for getting the state wrong because this is
Sure. Let me say
I love this state. It's a grand old state.
Oh my gosh. I'm not picking up what you're laying down, unfortunately. It's not clicking. I'm going to say Texas.
Well, maybe I spoke a little too rapid for you.
Michigan.
Oh, there you go. There you go with a little hint. It's a WWF at the Welsh Auditorium, Grand Rapids, Michigan, Saturday, November 20th, 1993.
Oh, yes.
And so can you tell me, because the state was a little tough, but can you tell me what the championship was that Razor Ramon was defending against IRS?
That would probably be the Intercontinental title.
Boom goes the dynamite. Once again, Mike Rogers comes through. And I want to thank Jody Day for that. It's a weird, every card had Steve Dahl on it. Who would have known? But Jody, thanks for your help. It's always great to look through your scrapbooks. If you ever get a chance to see Jody out at Independent Wrestling or at another expo, ask her to look through the scrapbooks. They're great. And Mike, 3 last time, 2 out of 3 this time.
I'm a little bitter that I lost my perfect streak.
Well, in reality, you're a little bitter all the time, so this isn't anything unusual. But percentage-wise, you're doing Hall of Fame work, and that is very, very good. So good news is, Mike, you survived another round of Card Shark. The bad news, Lisa still has a deck. Now, on to another of those guys that you just shake your head at what could have been. Let's talk about Tully Blanchard.
Tully Blanchard's here, and I find this fascinating because he comes to the Northwest. He's been in wrestling for 5 years. He's not a wet behind the ear rookie. He's already held the Southwest TV title on several occasions. So he debuts in Portland on February 11th, 1979, and he only stays 1 month. It was a very good time in the territory, lots of talent. He had wins over Lanny Holiday, and he had draws with Matt Bourne, Johnny Eagle, Hector Guerrero, and then he has losses to Johnny Boy, Dutch Savage, Adrian Adonis. His highest profile match, or most interesting match, was teaming with Roddy Piper and facing Adrian Adonis and Ron Starr, who were the tag champs at the time. Look at the talent, though, in that match. That's amazing. I was a little surprised he didn't get any more than he got. It's a little unclear why his stay was cut so short. A few years later, he's one of the biggest names in the business.
Unbelievable that he was here for such a short time, but really it turned out to be, as you mentioned, one of the biggest names in the business. Now, let's look at a name wrestling fans will know, but maybe not for all the reasons that they should. Let's talk about a man who wrestled as handsome Paul Bosch.
Paul Bosch, we know him as the promoter, one of the greatest promoters ever, and he promoted out of Houston, Texas. Some people may not realize that he was a wrestler. He did wrestle very early in his career. Here we are, Don Owen and Paul Bosch. They're often mentioned hand in hand as being the most honest promoters in wrestling. So Bosch starts in 1932, and he had matches as late as 75. Those are kind of gimmick type matches in his own promotion. But the bulk of his career is between 1932 and 1947. He wrestles here as early as 1934, and he would have wins over Chief Little Wolf, Jack Forsgren, Hans Schroeder, Brother Jonathan. And he would wrestle in the Northwest off and on from 1934 to 1938.
And he was really pushed here because of his background as a football star at Northwestern University, which, if you look back at the people that were being pushed back in the 30s and early 40s, a lot of them were athletes that came out of college, football stars or wrestling stars. And so you mentioned Brother Jonathan. Well, Brother Jonathan is the father of who?
Don Leo Jonathan.
Oh, and you thought crazy Chuck Carbo was crazy. Well, Brother Jonathan was. He was a hymn-singing, psalm-shouting, often quoting Bible verses during matches, gimmick, and adding to his gimmick, he famously brought in a defanged 7-foot rattlesnake named Cold Chills into the ring, creating a memorable and intimidating performance for the audience. Nothing like a hymn-singing wrestler with a rattlesnake to bring in the crowds. Now, we mentioned Tully Blanchard before. The other wrestler that you and I both think would have been incredible to watch develop, and that's Gino Hernandez.
Gino Hernandez comes here in 1977, and that's another wrestler that you really feel the Northwest dropped the ball on. He had already captured the United States title in Detroit, the Sheik's promotion. And what a out-of-the-box wrestler to go there and win the title. He had also won the Texas tag titles with Jimmy Snuka earlier in 77. Gino debuts here September 24th. It was a really good time for talent. He's kind of slotted in the mid-card. He has wins over Bobby Kincaid and Coco Samoa and Ed Wiskowski. He goes to draws with Johnny Boyd, John Anson, and Dutch Savage. So you have Jimmy Snuka, Dutch Savage, and Lonnie Main here at the time. So they're on top of the babyface side. There just probably isn't much room for Gino to get into the main event. But with his look, I sure would have given him a shot if I were promoting. Bobby Kincaid, who we mentioned Gino got a win over, he concurred in his Ring Around the Northwest interview. He says, I don't think they used Gino the right way. I really believe when you have Buddy Rose and Dutch Savage and Ed Wiskowski, there wasn't much room at the top of the cards, but he really believed that Gino could have been used a little bit better. There is a recent book about Gino Hernandez. It's called I Am Your Champion by Lizzie Flanagan. And I haven't read it yet, but I tried to find the part where, or if there was a part about his Portland run. And there was a few paragraphs. It mentioned that fans here might have remembered his stepfather, Luis Hernandez, who had wrestled in Portland before. I do not think that's the case. Despite the book saying that, I don't think anybody would have remembered him. The book then mentions that Gino is very green on his Portland run. I'm looking forward to reading that book and really delving into Gino Hernandez. Unfortunately, he passes away in 1986 at the age of 29, right while he's on top in Texas and really getting his career going.
Yeah, and his death was by a cocaine overdose, and it was actually covered in the After magazines, which was incredibly rare at that time. Wrestlers' deaths were usually covered as heart attacks, but not drug-related. It was a really big deal for that article to come out. Now, maybe we've talked about famous wrestlers, but maybe arguably the most famous wrestler to ever grace the Northwest for the Owen promotion. Let's talk about Mr. Quasimodo.
And he is better known as Antonio Inoki. And, we mentioned Carlos Colon as one of the wrestlers who have probably drawn one of the most money in wrestling. Here's your other example of that, Antonio Inoki. He debuts in the Northwest in November of 1964, and he would stay a little over a year. Unfortunately, he'd be stuck in preliminaries that entire time. He would get some wins over guys like Apache Lightfoot, Larry Williams, Indian Joe, El Sharif, Pat Patterson, and Juan Sebastian.
And of course, Inoki famously battled Ric Flair in North Korea in 1995, two matches that reportedly drew 165,000 and 190,000, kind of what I was drawing at Portland Wrestling at Cleveland Armory. And he battled Muhammad Ali in the boxing wrestling fiasco in Japan, which drew that incredible 87 rating in Japanese television, which will never be broken anywhere in the world. That's an amazing number. He's the founder of New Japan Pro Wrestling, really is given the credit for the push of strong style wrestling, very involved in the creation of MMA. But in Portland, as you mentioned, just a preliminary wrestler. It's why you always say you never know who the person you are watching wrestling will become. Now, the second concert I ever went to was the Steve Miller Band, and I listened to them sing Fly Like an Eagle. So let's talk about Eagle, Bobby Bald Eagle.
Well, Bob Boyer turned into Bobby Bald Eagle. He started his career in 1955 and he came to the Northwest in January of 1963. He's a preliminary babyface wrestler and he didn't get very many wins. He had wins over Pat O'Brien and Haru Suzuki. But in 1972, he goes to the Indianapolis area and he joins up with Billy Red Cloud and he becomes Bobby Bald Eagle. And so they make a very charismatic team. Just even looking at pictures of them, you can tell that, with their gimmicks, with the look of Billy Red Cloud especially, they have a lot of charisma. Bob Boyer lives to the nice age of 93, and he just passed away earlier this year in January.
And after retiring from wrestling, he worked as a Boilermaker for Amtrak for 30 years. And he is in the Indianapolis Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, along with Nick Gomez, better known as El Bracero, who has an interesting fun fact related to Portland wrestling, doesn't he?
He was supposed to come here, El Bracero. He was billed for a few weeks to be coming here, and then evidently his plans changed, and he did not show up.
And I know our listeners all are wanting to know, as an FYI, my first concert was at the Portland Auto Show 1965 with Diana Ross and the Supremes. Okay, now to one of my favorite interviews you conducted, and it's in both Excitement in the Air Volume 1 and Oh Yeah, The History of Hawaii Wrestling, both available on Amazon, and that's Pampero Firpo. If you know nothing about Firpo and you read this interview, you will be absolutely fascinated with him and look up everything you can. Mike, talk about Pampero Firpo, the original missing link.
Yeah, I was so happy with that interview. He's so smart and so articulate, even though English isn't his first language. So it was a little bit hard to decipher everything he was saying. And I know that it was hard to edit that interview, but his intelligence and articulate nature come through, even though at times it was hard. For the career that he has later, I'm a little bit shocked that he was in the Northwest. He comes here in April of 64. He gets early wins. He's getting a push over Luther Lindsay, Patty Barrett, Bobby Shane, Nick Kozak, Tony Bourne, Buddy Marino. He gets an NWA title shot against Lou Thez on July 30th, 1964. And he talks about this match. He was a little worried about if Thez was going to put him through the ringer. And so this is what he says. I went to him and we talked. I worried he would test me, but we were fine. As good as I was, Lou Thez was 10 times better. And that shows you what kind of class he had. A long time later, I saw him in 1965 in Texas and we wrestled against each other. I said, Lou, you don't have to put it on me again. And Lou says, no, it's too hard. And Firpo says, good. In Hawaii, he saw Lou Thez again, and he had just come in from Japan. And Thez asked Firpo if he would hold his money. He says, it's $60,000. He said, hold my money, and then we'll go out and have a good meal. In his interview, Firpo doesn't say exactly, but something happened in Oregon that he didn't want to talk about. He said that he had come in to let his hair and beard grow out. He talked about meeting Dean Silverstone, but he said there was something that happened that he didn't really want to elaborate on. He would win the Northwest title during his stay in Portland. He'd later become one of the biggest names in wrestling with huge impact in Hawaii, Detroit, Texas, Los Angeles, and a lot of other territories.
Yeah, the history of Hawaii wrestling available on Amazon. Not sure I've mentioned that yet. Furpo's interview is there along with an interview with Mary Fry's, Furpo's daughter, who gives us some amazing insights into who her dad was, both inside the ring and outside the ring. It's a great interview, and you'll learn a lot about who the man, Pampero Furpo, really was. Now, you mentioned 1964, and you look at that list: Luther Lindsay, Bobby Shane, Tony Bourne, Buddy Marino. And if you go to the Portland Sports Arena opening in 68 through February of 69, all four of those guys are here again, but big names in wrestling. Now, Mike, let's move on to the Hangman. No, not the AEW's Adam Page, but the Hangman in Portland was who?
It was Cyclone Negro. And Cyclone Negro was a pretty big heel, well known throughout the territories. It's interesting he comes here and puts on a mask. In August of 1964, it's the only time that he uses this name. He had been on top in Texas, and he had just won the All-Asia Tag title with Gene Kaninsky. And over his career, he'd go on to win a wheelbarrow of titles, in a lot of different territories. Now, Buddy Marino, also known as Omar Atlas, was very, very good friends with Cyclone, and they found themselves in many, many different territories together. Marino talks about his friendship with Cyclone. He says, "We were good friends. We met at the gym in Caracas, Venezuela. We both worked out. We were in Texas together. We were in San Francisco together, and then in Florida. And it was in Florida they decided to be billed as brothers." He said, "Our friendship has lasted over 30 years. And they were in this territory together as well, because Hangman would rack up wins over Bobby Shawn, Buddy Marino, Luther Lindsay, and Pepper Martin. He would come back later in 1967 and wrestle under his own name in one of those kind of extravaganza cards that were happening right at the time. And often they would bring a match up from San Francisco to be the semi-main event. And he wrestled Pepper Gomez and lost on DQ in this match. He had a tremendous feud with Dory Funk Sr., and he had a death match with Dory Funk Sr. that reportedly went 4 hours, which is just amazing. I saw Cyclone Negro on a TV show called Lie Detector, and it was hosted by F. Lee Bailey. And he was hooked up to the lie detector and then asked if wrestling was fake or not. And he, of course, insisted that it was real, and the results showed he was lying, and that wrestling maybe wasn't on the up and up. And in true wrestler style, he stormed off the set.
Nice. F. Lee Bailey. If listeners don't know who F. Lee Bailey is, look him up, because him as the host of Lie Detector was classic. Now, in wrestling, after wrestling, he was really like Al Madrill, who wanted nothing to do with wrestling. His second wife's named Cheryl, and she said he was just done with it. And he didn't stay connected to anyone in the business. He just wanted to live a quote-unquote a normal life. You mentioned his match with Terry Funk, and in Funk's autobiography, he wrote this about Negro. He said, "He always kept his body in great shape and had one of the greatest, most expressive faces I've ever seen. He had the greatest face in the business. It made him the perfect heel. He wasn't hideously ugly. He just looked like one mean son of a bitch." Now, you talked about the death match that went 4 hours in 1973. Cheryl distinctly remembers that one. She says they both went to the hospital after the match. It was part of the plan. He put Alka-Seltzer in his mouth to look like he was foaming. When he went to the hospital, it was kind of hard for me to keep a straight face, but the doctor is telling me, "We think he might have a broken neck." All this crazy stuff. The doctor was facing me, standing in front of the stretcher. My husband was there looking at me, making all these crazy faces that he would make, because even the doctors were fooled that he was injured. When the doctor came back to the room, Cyclone jumped up from the bed, said he was going home, and left the hospital. That's a classic story. Now to one of my favorite names on this list, Mike, and I'll just say the Winged Eagle, 10 pounds of gold, Madonna's hard candy, and literally 1,000 more, averaging more than 100 per year, all made by hand. Of course, I'm talking about Reggie Parks.
Reggie Parks was trained by Stu Hart, and we're going to hold on to that thought. Reggie Parks began his career in 1955, and he comes to the Northwest in June of 1956. He's paying his dues. The wins were kind of few and far between. He faced men as Red Bastien, Kurt von Pappenheim, Reggie Siki, Don Kindred, Ed Francis, and he would stay in the territory until May of 1957. He would return in 58 and 59. He would hold his share of titles over his career, including the Central States title and many tag titles, including the Midwest tag title on 8 different occasions. But he would really make a name for himself in a different manner in wrestling because he became the king of belt makers, the king of belts. He would make belts for any territory that needed them. And that's how the business that he went into. Parks had a great body. There's a magazine article that I noticed entitled Body Beautiful, That's Reggie Parks. He was known to be a very quiet and likable person, which makes this story really humorous. And I don't remember exactly if I heard this while I was at Cauliflower Alley, but this is a great story. So Stu Hart, who trained Reggie Parks, and Reggie Parks were at this particular Cauliflower Alley, and the story goes that Stu's phone rings, and the voice on the other line identifies himself as Stu's friend, Reggie Parks. Parks then tells Stu that he was always much tougher and a much better wrestler than Stu. And to prove it, Reggie says, "Why don't you come meet me downstairs?" Now, Stu reportedly comes unglued and is well on his way to the lobby to meet up with that loudmouth Reggie Parks. But the kicker of the story is that turned out to be Owen Hart playing a rib on both Stu and Reggie. He knew he'd wind up Stu, get him all wound up. Luckily, they didn't have it out in the lobby.
We can never get enough Stu Hart stories. And it's so amazing to think that so many of our memories with wrestling revolve around title belts. And in our minds, we can picture those belts, whether the Portland belts or the 10 pounds of gold. And right here in Portland, the guy who would become the best of the best in belt making was working inside the ring here in Portland. Now, a few notes. You mentioned he had an athletic body, and he did the gimmick of having a cast iron stomach. And to prove it, Parks once had a Volkswagen Beetle driven over his stomach. Yes, that exact gimmick would be done a little bit later by Pepper Gomez. But in wrestling, if it works, steal it. Now, I mentioned the 10 pounds of gold, but he most famously designed the heavyweight and tag titles belts that I used in Portland wrestling. Absolutely true. They were his favorite belts of all time, is what he would have told me if I ever asked him. Now, to the last name on the envelope. And I was surprised back when we created this list that you demanded this guy be put on the list, because we've talked about some old timers, some legends, some guys that would go on to become legends. But this guy, he was only here for 3 months in 1985. Sure, he formed maybe the best babyface tag team of that time frame in Portland, much better than that Southern Rockers that most fans would say was the best, because they weren't. Sorry, Jody Day. But you want to talk about Joe Savoldi? What has gotten into you?
Wait a minute. Now, there was 2 Joel Savoldis, and there was the original Joe Savoldi. He started wrestling in 1931, and he was called Jumping Joe Savoldi. He ended most of his matches with a drop kick, and he also used the flying tackle, and that was related to his Notre Dame football career. He came to the Northwest in July of 1934, where he immediately found himself in main events with really top-notch wrestlers from all over. He had wins over Jack Forsgren, Ivan Manigoff, Bob Cruz, Ted Cox, and Ted Thigh. And reportedly in his match with Ted Thigh, he demonstrated a new move. Get this, an elbow drop into the ribs.
Oh, dastardly.
Now, on August 31st of 34, he lost a match for the NWA title against Jim Londas in Seattle. He returned to the Northwest in 1935, and he had another NWA title match with Londas in Portland on April 3rd. He continues to make spot appearances in the Northwest through the 30s. And in 1942, he returns for a more sustained run, and he has wins over Brother Jonathan, who we mentioned before, Chief Little Wolf, and Dude Chick. In 1947, he has a few more matches. He wrestles until 1952, and then he passes away in 1974 at 95 years of age.
Oh, that Joseph Oldie. And as Gilda Radner would say on Saturday Night Live, never mind. You mentioned too Chick, who would go on to have cameo spots in Westerns as a stuntman for a number of different actors at that time. Dude, Chick, look him up, kids. Mike, that was fun tonight.
Wait,
because-
I got one more. This is so fun. I've got one more that I have to add. So we're going to go to about the year 2000. We're at the Milwaukee Elks, and it's just a group of local wrestlers, and I love to use this phrasing that I used at that time. I'd said, if you were to think that one of these wrestlers is going to headline WrestleMania, I'd say you had a better chance of getting struck by lightning. But you know what? Rebecca Quinn was on that card. She's better known as Becky Lynch. Frank, did you ever have a chance to use Becky Lynch on any of your cards?
Let me see. I did promoting Portland Wrestling. I had an email from this lady who wanted to come down from Canada and work for us.
Oh, I bet those were some great matches.
Well, see, we didn't really have women wrestling at the time.
What?
We were too busy using stars like the Grappler, Roddy Piper, guys that were stars. And we didn't have the lady wrestlers. We had Mischievous, who we won't talk about at this time. But we didn't. But yeah, thanks for reminding me that I could have booked her in Portland Wrestling. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I appreciate that. Well, Mike, as I started to say before I was so rudely interrupted, Mike, this was fun tonight because this wasn't about the biggest names or the longest runs or even the main events. This was about something else. This was about the guys who came through Portland, sometimes for a month, sometimes for a year, sometimes just a handful of matches, but they worked here, and that matters. Because when you look back at a territory like Portland, you realize it wasn't just built on the names everyone remembers. It was built on the names that passed through. The future champions, the hidden talents, the guys who were just getting started, or the ones who were on their way to somewhere else. From the mighty Igor to Antonio Inoki, from Tully Blanchard to Gino Hernandez, from Jumbo Tsuruta to Magnum TA. You never really knew what you were seeing at the time. Were they just another name on the card until they became something more? And that's what makes Portland wrestling special, because on any given night, you might be watching history and not even know it. Mike, great stories tonight. Any final thoughts?
It was a lot of fun looking through some of these wrestlers that I'd forgotten had ever appeared here and looking at some of their early parts of their career. Lots of fun.
And so to our listeners, next time you look at an old card or hear a name you don't recognize right away, take a second look, because chances are they worked here. And that means they're part of the Ringside in Rose City story. As we said, we've got 1,000 of them. Mike and I, we always appreciate your support because while we like talking to each other, sometimes we love sharing wrestling history with you, our listeners. So be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a moment of great Ringside stories. And new episodes, remember, drop every Thursday. So until next time, I'm Frank Culbertson alongside
Mike Rogers.
And this has been Ringside in Rose City. Wrestling the way it should be. Lisa, take us home.
And that's a wrap from Ringside in Rose City, where one ring, one city, and 1,000 stories never fail to deliver. I'm Lisa Hughes, and this has been a Yaski production. Catch every episode on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your wrestling fix. Until next time, keep your boots laced, your popcorn buttered, and your stories ready.